Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be taking an in-depth look at how to play La Campanella, which I recently recorded for my channel. I'm going to leave timestamps in the description, so if there's a specific spot that you're struggling with, you can skip ahead to that. But I've structured the video in a somewhat cumulative way, so it might be easiest to follow if you watch it from the beginning. This is the first in a series of 3 planned videos, each of which will cover roughly 4 pages of the piece. Okay, so for these opening octaves, my biggest piece of advice is just not to neglect them when you're practicing. So in terms of technique, they're not really that hard, so it can be kind of tempting to just skip over them and go straight into the jumps, but I always find that the simpler something is, the easier it is to kind of get inside my head when I go to perform it and realize, oh, I have no clue how I actually usually play this. So there are probably any number of ways that you could do it, but I like to do it with kind of a lift of my wrist on each set, like this. The important thing isn't so much how you do it as that you have a plan for how to do it so that you don't mess it up when you go to do it under pressure. Okay, so now we come to the theme. Obviously the big difficulty here is the jumps in the right hand, but before we get into that, I want to quickly take a look at what the left hand is doing. So the left hand has these wide stretching rolled chords, some of which are actually a wider stretch than my hand can reach. But even if I could reach them, I probably wouldn't want to, because a stretched hand is a tense hand, and excess tension is going to cut into my control and lead to fatigue over time. So what I want to do instead is basically imagine the position I would use to block that chord, and then relax that hand position a little bit. Then, as I roll across the chord, I close into a relaxed position at the top. Similarly, in my right hand, I try to avoid stretching any wider than I really have to. Even though some of the intervals cover 2 octaves, my hand is rarely stretched more than 1 octave. And at times, I even close to a 5th or a 6th. At first glance, it might seem like my hand is traveling in a straight line from left to right, but a closer look reveals that it's actually moving in a slight arc. This is because most of the movement comes from pivoting at the elbow. Despite the somewhat square layout of the keyboard, this kind of arcing movement is simpler and more natural than trying to move in a straight line, and is therefore more efficient. I also use a bit of forearm rotation to play this passage, which both reduces the workload of the fingers and makes it easier to get consistent dynamics. Basically, as I'm going between the thumb and pinky, my whole arm is rotating slightly, almost like I'm turning a doorknob. When you're first starting out with this piece, it might be tempting to kind of try forcing it by stopping over each note before you play it. But I would recommend not doing this. This is kind of like driving with your parking brake on. It might seem like it's working, but it won't get you far. When I play like this, my muscles are working against themselves. For each note, I have to exert effort both to create momentum and then again to stop that momentum. Instead, I'd recommend trying to make the movement as fluid as possible right from the start. Think of trying to bounce off each note and redirect the momentum that's already there rather than starting from scratch each time you change directions. This may feel harder to control at a slower tempo, but physically it's much easier and more relaxed. When you're first learning the piece, I wouldn't worry too much about whether you're hitting all the right notes. Instead, prioritize finding a good movement that will still work at faster speeds. With practice, a good movement should result in accurate playing, but hitting all the right notes at a slow tempo is no guarantee that the movement you're using will still work at performance tempo. Next we come to this restatement of the theme, now ornamented with grace notes. The basic technique here is the same, but the grace notes add a new element of precision. Here, I find that it's helpful to think of jumping to hand positions rather than to individual notes, and to think about where on each key I want to place my fingers. In general, I want to play closer to the front edge of the keys for better leverage, but if my thumb is on a black key, I'd prefer to slide my index finger farther back on the key rather than contort my hand position to get both fingers at the edge of the keys. I always find that the hardest part here is the group of 3 notes. If I'm not careful, my third finger always wants to slip off of its key and hit the white key to the right. But I found that if I just think of slightly sticking my elbow out and turning my hand a little bit to the left, that usually solves the problem. So now obviously this adjustment is pretty subtle, so you might have to experiment a bit to figure out what works for you. Or you might even be lucky enough not to find this passage as difficult as I did. But I wanted to mention it to point out that in passages this difficult, I often find thinking more big picture stuff, like what I'm doing with my elbow or my wrist, can be more reliable than trying to micromanage every key press. This part can be tricky. For reading and memorizing it, I'd recommend analyzing the harmonies and looking for patterns. There are a lot of accidentals, but it basically boils down to chromatic thirds and an ascending sequence of dominant 7th chords and their resolutions. So for these chromatic thirds, you've got three main options. You can do left hand over right, or right hand over left, or what I do, which is actually to reverse which hand plays each line. I've seen people make all three options work, so it's mostly just down to personal preference. But the main takeaway is, don't be afraid to experiment with different redistributions to see what works best for you. For the next section, you might think the hard part would be all these high notes, and you'd be right. They are very hard. But even harder, at least for me, is getting all these 30-second notes to speak. For me, the hardest is this one with F sharp, E sharp, and D double sharp, so let's take an in-depth look at that. Here's a slow motion clip of just that measure. Here it is again. Notice how far to the right my wrist is turned when I reach that second group of 30-second notes. This is very much on purpose. The reason I do this is because these three keys are so clustered together. If my wrist is neutral, these fingers barely have any wiggle room. And I don't want to play out here at the tips of the keys because my thumb has to get to the A sharp, and I don't want it to need to travel so far. But by turning my hand to the right, I can get a little bit more wiggle room for these fingers without pulling my thumb so far away from the black keys. Now, if I had plenty of time to get into position before playing these 30-second notes, that little bit of wiggle room wouldn't matter so much. But as it is, I'm leaping to this position from a much higher note, so I only have a very short amount of time to get set up. This also means that my hand is going to have a lot of momentum to the left, so I want to choreograph my movement in such a way that I'm accounting for and taking advantage of that momentum rather than fighting against it. Even with this little wrist adjustment, this passage feels very precise, but I generally find that I get the most consistent results in my playing when I both try to be as precise as possible and give myself as much wiggle room as I can. Of course, this movement is very custom tailored to my hand, so you might have to experiment a little bit to figure out what works best for you. But I wanted to examine the way I play it in detail to illustrate how much precision and awareness it takes to get consistent results in a piece of this difficulty. By the way, that's probably as good of a time as any to segue into a general point I wanted to make about playing this piece. This is a virtuosic etude, so it's natural to want to play it fast, but there are a lot of ways to increase your speed other than just trying to go as fast as possible. Improving your precision and awareness are two big ones, but practicing under tempo for consistency, efficiency, as well as ease and relaxation are all things that will translate to being able to play the piece faster. On the other hand, the movements used to play at full tempo will be slightly different from what works when playing slower, so sometimes the answer really is to practice at full speed. If I only have a few minutes or hours to prepare a piece for performance, I'll usually do most of my practicing at performance tempo. But in my experience, optimal control comes from being able to play at a wide spectrum of tempi. This part uses basically the same technique as the opening, but now the pinky has the melody instead of the thumb, which I find makes it a little easier. My biggest piece of advice here is to be aware of your eyes. Unless your peripheral vision is a lot better than mine, you probably won't be able to see most of the notes you're hitting. With enough practice, that shouldn't matter, but in passages like this, I always find that planning where to look reduces the chance of second-guessing my technique under pressure. The only really new technique here is these double note passages. Here, I try to generate most of the movement with my wrist with a drop, lift, drop, lift, drop, lift, and then this group of four, which I kind of do with a counterclockwise circle of my wrist. I'm exaggerating these movements to demonstrate, so at full tempo they'll be much smaller. Maybe something like that. Here's a clip of this passage in slow motion. This next part can be a bit unfortunate for people who enjoy hitting correct notes. This 2-octave leaping figure is pretty delicate, and it keeps repeating for a while, so you want to get pretty comfortable with it. So, a few tips here. First, don't forget to practice the transition into it. You're coming from this tremolo right before, so all your hand's momentum is going to be pretty much confined to a narrow space. Then you've got to generate this huge burst of momentum all of a sudden, and then settle into a new, equilibrium. It's kind of like merging onto a highway, I guess. I don't really drive. Once you get going on the new figure, my advice would be to think about your middle finger. So I like to aim for about an inch from the back of the key. This allows me to put my thumb right at the tip of its key without losing control of the middle finger's note. So depending on the shape of your hand, this might be different, but that's what works for me. I don't want my finger to be too vertical, because if it's a little bit flat, I can use this part of my finger, which has more surface area than the tip. I'm basically aiming for the center of the key in terms of left to right, but if I miss by a little bit, I'd rather be too far to this side, because then I can still catch the key with the side of my finger, whereas if I slip off the key to the left, I'm not going to hit it at all. I find that as long as I can get my middle finger consistent, the thumb usually finds its note. For my pinky, it's kind of outside my peripheral vision, so I basically monitor where it is by thinking about the angle of my wrist. I do it by feel and kind of imagine snapping my wrist back when I hit a certain point. It's a pretty precise movement, but at least it's consistent from one measure to the next, so with some practice, this can become reasonably reliable. This next variation I actually find to be surprisingly chill, with the exception of just a few measures. The subdivisions get faster and we've got some repeated notes to worry about now, but the jumps are so much more manageable that I actually find this part easier than all the previous sections. So first, let's take a look at the basic movement. Here's a slow motion clip. The idea is to play a note with the index finger, repeat it with the thumb, then leap an octave to the same note played by the pinky. A few things worth mentioning here. Every time I play with my index finger, my hand is closing to a pretty narrow position. At most, I'm spanning about 1 octave right as I reach up to the pinky, but I only hold this stretch for a split second before relaxing my hand. Also, I'm releasing each note as quickly as I can after playing it, basically playing staccato. Notice how by the time my thumb reaches the note the index finger just left, my index finger is already pretty far away from the key. With repeated notes, the biggest bottleneck is usually not how quickly I can get the next finger into position, but rather how quickly I can get the previous finger out of the way, allowing the key to reset in time to be played again. So that's the aspect I focus on most in my practice. Now let's look at the hard part. Here's another slow motion clip. The difficult thing here is managing my momentum to the right such that each finger reaches its note just when it needs to, but without any unwanted accents. For me, the trick is in getting my wrist to move as smoothly as possible. So far in this variation, I've maintained a fairly neutral wrist, but here, right as I hit the low D sharp, I turn my hand sharply to the right. This moves my 4th, 3rd, and 2nd fingers to the right, while keeping my wrist pretty far to the left. Then, as I play the rest of the bar, I try to keep my wrist moving to the right at as close to a uniform speed as possible, unwinding back to a neutral wrist as I reach the highest octave. This keeps the motion feeling fluid and helps to avoid unwanted accents. You might need to experiment a bit to figure out what works for you, but whether you're practicing this passage fast or slow, I'd highly recommend focusing on getting your wrist movement as smooth as you can. Okay, so that's as far as I wanted to go for this first video. This might be a minority view, but in my opinion, the first third of this piece is probably actually the hardest part. It doesn't seem so hard to get it to the point where it's like almost ready to go, but I found that as I was trying to clean the piece up to get it ready for a recording, I was spending more time on these opening jumps than any of the seemingly more virtuosic stuff that comes later in the piece. So to wrap up this video, I wanted to share some tips for practicing. Obviously, everybody's going to have different stuff that works best for them, so do what feels most natural to you. But I found that I had the best results when I alternated slow practice and fast practice. So as I mentioned before, when I'm practicing slowly, I'm trying to keep the motion as fluid as possible and as similar as I can to what I'm going to be doing when I play quickly. And when I do practice quickly, I'm mostly sticking to pretty small chunks of the piece, and I'm trying to make the motion as relaxed as possible and focus on redirecting the momentum that's already there rather than stifling it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next one, we're going to be talking about the section with 30-second notes.